The message on my smartphone took me by surprise. My lover is pregnant, so we're getting a divorce. Review the court papers and respond ASAP. Pack your things and leave quickly. I stared at the screen, stunned. He'd been having an affair, and now this, the news of a pregnancy. I tried calling him repeatedly, but he never answered. All I could manage was a simple yes. A month later, after moving out and without saying anything further, I began receiving persistent calls from my ex-husband. I hadn't spoken to him since the divorce, and despite having nothing left to discuss, I felt compelled to respond. When I finally did, he erupted into rage, screaming at me. Meanwhile, my life with my husband Mark and my mother-in-law had been surprisingly smooth. I had always thought mother-in-law issues were a fictional trope, but I came to appreciate just how wonderful mine was. I heard my coworkers complain about their in-laws and realized how fortunate I was. I made an effort to treat her with more respect and care. When my mother-in-law fell ill and was hospitalized, I started working from home to care for her. Initially, Mark was supposed to be the primary caregiver, but it fell to me. She would smile apologetically in the hospital, saying, "Thank you for everything. I'm sorry for being a burden. I wish I could be happy instead." I truly loved her. We shared close moments over tea, movies, and shopping. She often joked about my husband, saying he lacked compassion, though it was clear she said it with a hint of loneliness. "He just lies around when he comes home from work. I'll give him a lecture when I get out." Unfortunately, she never had the chance and passed away. After the funeral, I found myself alone at home, reminiscing about her. Her portrait showed her smiling peacefully, but her absence left a void in my heart. My husband hadn't returned home since the funeral and hadn't even visited his mother in her final days. There was nothing left to discuss with him, but I felt deep sadness for my mother-in-law, who had left this world without seeing her son one last time. Determined to confront Mark, I tried to locate him. He barely responded to emails and hung up when I called. It wasn't just about reminiscing. There were many unresolved issues between us that needed to be addressed. My voice echoed in the empty house as I waited for him to return. My phone vibrated with a new email notification. It was from Mark. I opened the email, half expecting the same message. "My mistress is pregnant, so I want a divorce. Review the court papers and respond ASAP. Pack your things and leave quickly." I read the message in disbelief. Was this the same woman he was having an affair with? I couldn't believe it. "She's pregnant." The message on my smartphone left me stunned. I repeatedly tried to reach Nick, but no matter how many times I called, he didn't answer. When the call connected, I only got a recorded message. "After 20 years of marriage, was it really ending like this, with just one email?" As I listened to the dial tone, tears began to overflow. I couldn't hold back my sobs any longer and gave up on the call, throwing my smartphone aside in despair. This was happening too soon after my mother-in-law's death. I hadn't even had the chance to mourn her properly. I tried contacting Nick repeatedly after that, but he never responded, not to my calls, not to my emails. It seemed our relationship was truly over. We never had any significant conversations about what was happening. I had simply replied yes to his email and left the house. A month has passed since the divorce was finalized. I've rented a room in a single-story house and am experiencing living alone for the first time in 20 years. I'm still working remotely, a necessity I took up to care for my mother-in-law, but now I find it suits me well. The convenience of working from anywhere with just a computer has been surprisingly fitting, and living alone again feels surprisingly comfortable. It's easy to take care of just myself. Caring for my mother-in-law wasn't a burden due to my affection for her, but waiting for Nick's uncertain return had been more stressful than I realized. I once believed Nick wouldn't have an affair. Friends had asked if I had doubts about him, but I laughed it off, thinking he wasn't the type. Now, I've painfully realized that people change. The Nick I was initially attracted to was diligent and loving, although not very successful in his job. Over time, he changed, but the shift was so gradual that I didn't notice it. I should have recognized it when he left all the responsibilities to me. The kind Nick I once knew no longer exists. Reflecting on it now seems pointless. What I need is a break. As I stood up, trying to lift myself out of my gloomy thoughts, I decided to make some coffee and enjoy the cake I had bought yesterday. The perks of working from home. Amused, I hurried back to my seat with a cup of coffee and a slice of cake. I savored each bite, feeling quite content, a sign that my mood had improved significantly. My feelings for Nick had completely cooled off. Just as I was pondering this, my smartphone vibrated. I glanced at the screen and saw Nick's name. I didn't want to let him ruin the uplifted mood I had finally achieved, so I chose not to answer. He had ignored my repeated calls before, so ignoring his call now felt like giving him a taste of his own medicine, an eye for an eye. I thought, justifying it to myself. Busy with work, I set my phone to silent mode and placed it a little out of reach. After enjoying my cake, I tried to focus on my tasks, but concentration eluded me. My phone kept vibrating incessantly. As soon as one call ended, another began, causing the phone to buzz repeatedly. Finally, I gave in and answered. "Hello. What do you think you're doing, Nick?" He interrupted loudly, cutting me off before I could greet him properly. I was about to be kicked out of the tower apartment. The thought weighed heavily on me, and Nick's incessant yelling on the other end of the line wasn't helping. "I've been trying to talk to you about this for months, but you ignored my calls and emails. Don't blame me for this," I said, shaking my head in frustration. Was he always this difficult? If this continued, I might really have to leave. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I sold the apartment," I replied with a sigh. "Sold it?" His voice wavered between shock and anger before softening slightly, as if he didn't believe me. "Don't joke with me. That's my tower apartment. Just because we're exes doesn't mean you can do whatever you want." "Your wife is pregnant," I retorted, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Your wife? You've got some nerve saying that to me," he snapped. "You know I tried to contact you, right? But you just walked away like nothing happened." "Contact me? Have you forgotten how many times I called and emailed you, trying to discuss something important? You ignored every single attempt. If only you had responded." "I'm busy with work," he interrupted dismissively. "Fine, goodbye." I ended the call, cutting off his continued shouting. How self-centered could he be? My phone buzzed again. Nick's name flashed on the screen, but I wasn't in the mood to deal with him. Tossing the phone onto the bed, I turned back to my work. Still, I couldn't help but reflect on the situation. Rumor had it that Nick's new wife was a younger, charming woman. Could someone like her really be drawn to an ordinary man like him? Cynically, I suspected it was all about money. Over the years, Nick hadn't contributed to our living expenses. Perhaps he was spending that money elsewhere. It explained the lifestyle he'd flaunted in the high-rise apartment, which had probably attracted her in the first place. But reality had a way of catching up. It turned out that right after moving in, he nearly got evicted. The financial ease he once enjoyed was gone, and I imagined this was an unexpected blow for his mistress. Nick, desperate to maintain appearances, was now scrambling to hold on to his new life. The so-called tower apartment wasn't even his. It belonged to his mother, who had bought it for us when we got married. "You're newlyweds, but if you're going to live with me, at least I want you to live somewhere nice," she'd said. I was impressed by her bold decision and grateful at the time. But Nick, ever pretentious, began referring to it as my tower apartment. It had always felt odd and uncomfortable hearing him call it that, especially knowing it wasn't his. My phone buzzed again, still vibrating insistently on the bed. Annoyed, I finally answered. Stop it. What do you want? I demanded. You sold my tower mansion, he shouted. Your tower mansion? I said coldly. That place belonged to your mother. Was it ever really yours? Now that she's gone, it's only natural for her daughter-in-law, who cared for her daily, to take over. You didn't even bother visiting her in her final days. Do you really think she'd leave her property to someone like you? That's not acceptable, Nick protested. It's more than acceptable, I replied, exasperated. It was her decision, clearly stated in her will. She wanted the apartment to go to someone who actually cared about her, not a son who shirked responsibility. Nick's protests continued, but I was done. His selfishness, his refusal to contribute financially, and his apathy toward his mother had hurt her deeply. She had confided in me, saying, if you split up, keep the apartment or sell it. Do whatever you think is best. Stop lying, he yelled. You must have made that up. I sighed. Nick, reflect on your behavior for once. This situation is a direct result of your actions. Maybe now you'll understand. But before I could finish, he hung up, as usual. 6 months later, as I stood at my mother-in-law's grave, I felt a pang of guilt for selling the apartment. I'm sorry for selling what you left me, I said softly, but I'm truly grateful for everything you did. As I left, I ran into Nick unexpectedly. His steps were heavy with anger, and behind him, a woman carried a baby. You made us move into a rundown flat, he accused. You sold the luxury apartment, give me some of the money. So you're still married, I said with a bitter smile, despite everything, and now you're upset about living in a shabby flat. Given your income, it's fitting. The high-rise was an exception. Turning to his wife, I added, you really missed out. You were drawn to his supposed wealth, and now look at him, just an ordinary man. The young woman's face fell. I just had a baby, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Living in that place is awful, especially for the child. But I felt no sympathy. Nick's choices had led to this, and they were no longer my concern. I understood her frustration. Given the context, it all made sense now. Hearing her words from someone who might have been involved in an affair must have been a traumatic experience for the child. If you want to improve your living conditions, I suggested, why not look for a part-time job? You need to live within your means. Their eyes widened in surprise, and they protested vehemently. They argued that a high-rise apartment lifestyle suited them, but I wasn't interested in their excuses. From what I could tell, they were overestimating their situation. Despite living in a modest flat, their inflated self-esteem was astounding. How honorable can someone who had an affair really be? I asked, my voice cold and sharp. Do you even realize that today is your mother's death anniversary? And yet here you are, making demands. When I glared at him, he retorted, his voice trembling, but I can't help it, I don't even know your address. Stop being so shameless, I snapped. This is pitiful. Even the worst person who's had an affair might be forgiven if they showed some compassion for the deceased. Taking a deep breath, I glanced at Naomi and the baby she was holding before turning back to Nick. There's something important we need to discuss, I said, ready to address the lingering issue. I hadn't had the chance to fully explain earlier. Nick had cut me off during our last conversation. There was something about that baby I needed to clarify. There's a strong possibility it might not be your child, I said. Nick's anger flared. Don't say such ridiculous things. You think you can just say whatever you want? His voice was heated, but he looked rattled. In contrast, Naomi's face went pale, her concern unmistakable. We both know we couldn't have children, I continued calmly. That's why I got checked out. I wanted a child. So I went to the doctor, but they found no issues with me. I asked you multiple times to go to the hospital, but you never did. So what are you implying? Nick's mocking smile only deepened my frustration. Of course, there's more to the story. You had a high fever as a child, didn't you? Your mother told me that could have caused your infertility. What are you talking about? Nick demanded. The reason your mother gave me the apartment wasn't just gratitude for living there, I explained. It was out of guilt. She felt responsible for you not being able to have children and apologized to me for not giving me grandchildren. It's not confirmed that your infertility is the cause, but maybe you should consider getting a DNA test. Nick, who had been listening quietly, lost his momentum. In a somber tone, he turned to Naomi. Let's go, he said, and they walked away. As they left, I called out one final thing. Oh, and I'll be demanding alimony for the mental distress, just so you know. With those last words, it felt like the ordeal was finally coming to a close. Several months later, I answered a call without checking the screen, my busy schedule making me careless. It's me. Are you doing well? Nick's voice came through. What do you want? I'm busy, I replied curtly. Listen, that baby isn't mine. I had my doubts after our conversation, and I had a test done. I've divorced Naomi, so, how about we start over? His attempt at reconciliation was laughable. Reconcile? After an affair? That's unthinkable, I said with a light chuckle. You're probably struggling living alone and just want to rely on me. I might consider hiring you as my secretary. My affection for Nick had vanished completely, but I still thought I was being generous. However, Nick wasn't pleased. Are you mocking me? Being your secretary? This is your last chance for reconciliation. I don't need such an opportunity, I replied honestly. You should look at things more objectively. Before I could finish, the call was abruptly cut off. How childish, I thought, to hang up just because he didn't like my response. Blocking all contact with Nick, I turned back to my work. I had started a new business with the funds from selling the apartment, establishing a company to support my livelihood. My experience caring for my mother-in-law and my natural business acumen had paid off. The business grew rapidly, and I now had a team of staff. It was all thanks to my kind mother-in-law. No matter how busy I got, I always made time to visit her grave on the monthly anniversary of her death, expressing my gratitude for the happy days she had helped provide. Nick wouldn't know, but I'd be back next month with renewed enthusiasm. I focused on my work, determined to make the most of my new life.